Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Terry, and I'm the CEO at the Columbus Council on World Affairs. We're really delighted to have you here in this warm, cozy place with a fireplace as you walk in, perfect for this snowy day. The reason we're here today, though, is to talk about disinformation and promise to you that this will be real information today. So this is not disinformation. We're going to be talking about disinformation. But the concept of disinformation really became a buzzword in the 2016 presidential election in reference to Russia's interference in our democratic process. But since then, disinformation operations from foreign governments really has increased, not just from Russia, though. We're going to talk a little bit more about China and Iran, who are now using some of the same tactics with other states. And so you've also probably been paying attention locally where with the Franklin County Board of Elections, there's been recent scares about potential hacking, which they trace to Russia. So this issue is not just important globally, it's important to us at the most local level. And as the world is increasingly interconnected through technology, democratic governments really must understand how to protect their people. And how do you counter these disinformation campaigns? It really doesn't just threaten voter decision-making capabilities, but it's really dividing democratic countries, creating opportunities for various serious threats and eroding the foundations that so many of our democratic countries stand on. To help us make sense of this new threat to democracy, we've asked Laura Rosenberger and Zachary Cooper, director and co-director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a bipartisan organization dedicated to combating disinformation threats to democracies around the world. We've asked them to help bring light to this discussion. Ms. Rosenberger, and I'll ask them to come up here so that we can begin speaking right away. Ms. Rosenberger brings her wealth of experience in foreign policy and national security. Prior to her work at the Alliance, she was a foreign policy advisor for Hillary Clinton's campaign and served in a variety of positions at the State Department and the White House's National Security Council. Dr. Cooper's expertise also lies in national security, specializing in U.S. defense strategy and alliances in Asia. Prior to his work, he served in the Pentagon and White House under the George W. Bush administration, first as Special Assistant to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and then as Assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism at the National Security Council. We're really thrilled to have both of these voices join us today to have a robust discussion. So please give a Columbus welcome to Ms. Laura Rosenberger and Dr. Zachary Cooper.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and kick off then, and I think we're just going to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to give some framing remarks just kind of about what we're talking about. Zach's going to come in with some points on some of the specifics to illustrate the problem, and then give some thoughts on the way forward, and then we look forward to having a conversation and taking your questions this morning. So I think the overview that Patrick provided actually really well encapsulated the problem as we see it. When we look at the increasing information age that is defining our geopolitical position in the world, we see that a range of actors, not just Russia, but China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, others, have realized that weaponizing social media and using other means to manipulate the information space is a way of really attacking democracies in particular, interfering in our democratic debate, and really, in many ways, weakening us from within. These are non-traditional weapons, and I think sometimes that makes it a bit more of a challenge for us to figure out both how to understand them and how to react. And I think that's why the experience with the 2016 election was such a sort of eye-opener for people, but also where we're still really trying to wrap our heads around what we should do about it. When we look at this tool and we look at how governments and their proxies from Moscow to Beijing to others are using it, this is what we think about as an asymmetric tool. It's low cost for them, but it can have a very high impact. And that also means that not all of it needs to be effective. They can throw a good bit of stuff at the wall to kind of see what sticks. I think it's really important to bear in mind as we get into this conversation today that in the US, we tend to talk about this very much in an election context, and about disinformation around elections in particular, or in favor of or against one particular candidate, or about information around elections themselves. But we were just having a conversation at my table just now about, for instance, the dynamics in India, where disinformation has been used both to froth up, various kind of violence against different communities, around different kinds of legislation that's being passed, and really, pull apart the social fabric of our societies. And that's just one particular example. But this is an issue that I think democracies globally are really wrestling with. I also think it's really important to bear in mind that this isn't just about information that's true or not. I think sometimes this gets very caught up in the conversation about a term that I'm only going to use one time today right now, which is quote unquote fake news. And while that's a complicated term for a lot of reasons, what I'd like to leave you with is the point that disinformation, which is kind of defined as false or manipulated content pushed deliberately, is really only a small part of what we're talking about when we see information manipulation happening in our societies. So a lot of times, even just looking at the campaign that the Russians mounted against our country, and by the way, continue to mount on a daily basis, a lot of what we've seen is taking on, for instance, fake personas who will spread opinions, trying to present themselves on social media to be somebody who feels very much like you and me, and somebody that we're going to relate to and we're going to sort of agree with or buy into or maybe take seriously what opinion they're pushing. And they use that to kind of pull the conversation to extremes, to inject different kinds of narratives, not necessarily true narratives or false narratives, but under a false guise. We also have seen the use of these platforms and the information space to actually organize real-world events. So one of the studies that came out looking at the known content from the Russian operations in and around 2016 was actually that there were 133 events that were organized, that Americans actually showed up to attend, thinking that it was people in their communities organizing events, when really it was a troll sitting in St. Petersburg being paid by Vladimir Putin's friends. Now, these are people who are showing up genuinely at an event because they agree with the position being taken there. But these are people who aren't going to show up there if they weren't being organized under a false pretense from thousands and thousands of miles away. And in some cases, these events were actually designed where you'd have two opposing protest and a counter-protest on the same set of issues, opposite sides of the street, same day, same time, and the intention actually seemed to really physically turn Americans against one another, and potentially even to provoke violence, which fortunately we didn't see. But that sort of tactic is exactly the kind of thing that we are deeply concerned about, that goes well beyond just the question of is a piece of content true or not, and I think speaks to the insidiousness of this. The last thing I would say is that when we really look at this, these tactics, the intention is very much often to undermine our faith in our institutions, and in some ways to undermine our belief in the very idea of truth. This idea that we can't believe anything we read or we see, and so many different opinions that are being manipulated in one way or another really has the effect of actually making us feel that nothing, we can't know anything to be true anymore. And this, for me, is one of the reasons why this matters so much. In a democracy, we are designed to have debates, and we are designed to have different opinions. And Zach and I are a bipartisan pair, as you probably gathered from the introduction. And I, have been active in the Democratic Party, and Zach on the Republican side. But we believe that in a democracy, we need to have the space to have debates about issues where we have different opinions. And when we erode this shared sense of truth, this sense that there is a common foundation from which we have debates, that's very corrosive on democracies themselves. The second thing I would say is that when we think about our institutions more broadly, and Patrick mentioned, some of the attacks on election infrastructure that we've seen here in Ohio and elsewhere, that's also aimed at undermining our faith in institutions. It's aimed at undermining our faith in the integrity of our election process. Our elections are based on trust. We trust the outcome of the election that is announced by election boards and certified by our bodies. And if we don't have the ability to trust in the outcome, again, that really undermines the very fabric of our democratic institutions. And then the last point on sort of why I think this matters is that when we, thinking about this from a national security perspective, the information age is really just at the beginning. And when we think about how data is exploding in the world, the means of manipulation, the ways that our information space is moving so quickly, this is a set of tools that we believe is going to be increasingly adopted by those who are trying to weaken our country and undermine the democratic values that are so important to us. And so we think it's really critical that we begin to both understand this challenge in a very clear way, but also develop some solutions.
That's fantastic, and it's so wonderful to get a chance to come out here to Columbus, and thank you so much to all of you for showing up. I know you're all busy. I want to build a little bit on what Laura said and talk about some of the bipartisan nature of this work, because I really do think it's important. Often we have heard most about the 2016 election in Russia, and that's how this manipulation of social media came to light for many of us. But in fact, this behavior has gone on for years and years, going back to the Soviet times with the Russian case. But I think sometimes it's actually easiest to detach what we are talking about from Russia, from 2016, and just talk more broadly about the type of activity that we're seeing. I spend a lot of my time looking at the Chinese Communist Party, right? And Russia and China do very different approaches in terms of their influence in the United States. But every single day, things that Americans are thinking and hearing are influenced tremendously by the Chinese Communist Party, and in ways that you might not even notice walking down the street. So let me give you a couple of examples. One, when I pick up my local newspaper in the morning, the Washington Post, every single day, that newspaper has an insert. That insert is entitled, "Everything You Need to Know About China." Who do you think is in charge of writing that insert? The propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party in the Washington Post every day. Same thing probably in your local newspapers. It's in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and it's online as well. When you go watch a movie, if you have paid attention to the last 5 or 10 years, you have probably seen a larger number of Chinese actors and actresses in those movies. Because now often for the movies to be released in China, which is the second largest movie market, they require to have a positive Chinese character in those movies. If you have ever heard of the platform TicTok, which I know a lot of kids use, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of, looks like parents nodding concerningly. Yeah, so TikTok is a social media platform where you get short snippets of video. And it turns out that this social media platform is owned by a Chinese company. And we now know, based on leaked documents, that this platform is censored substantially based on guidance from the Chinese Communist Party. And so if you look up something about, say, Hong Kong or human rights concerns in China, you often won't find anything on TikTok about that, because the way the artificial intelligence behind TikTok actually pulls out the data, they just don't allow that kind of content to be shared very easily. And so every day, as people are going through their daily lives, not just on social media, but on print media, on the internet, we're seeing ways that an authoritarian government is changing American views. And the one that's probably gotten the most attention recently was when a general manager in the National Basketball Association came out and made some comments supporting protesters in Hong Kong who are pro-democracy protesters. And the National Basketball Association went through a trying time in which they seemed initially like they were going to try and shut down discussion by players, by employees of the association, of efforts to support democracy in Hong Kong. So it's not even just that the Chinese Communist Party is able to censor speech in China, which has been existent for decades, but now we're actually seeing in some cases American companies tell or ask their employees not to talk about things that we're supposed to be allowed to talk about in the United States. And so I think this is one area where if we detach some of what we're talking about from 2016 and from Russia, we actually see that this shouldn't be a political issue, right? So I was in the Bush administration. If you're a Republican, you should want to stand up, right, and push back against this kind of foreign influence in our democracy, just the same way you would want to with a Democrat. And so I think, hopefully, we're moving towards a time when we can have a little bit more rational debate about some of these challenges. And that's why our organization is so focused, not just on the challenges from Russia, but the challenges from authoritarian states in general, right? Which have a different set of governing rules and a different set of interests from democratic states. And just the final thing I'll say is, this isn't just happening in the United States, right? And in fact, we in many ways are less vulnerable to these kinds of techniques than a lot of other countries because there's a lot more media options in the United States. There's a lot more money. And so if you want to influence an election here, it's really hard. You have to be really good at this, and you have to put a lot of effort and resources into it. And the Russians have certainly done that, and the Chinese are starting to. But if you go to any democracy around the world, I can guarantee you that they have concerns about influence in their own democracies. And especially if you're in a small country that's near, say, Russia or China, they're putting huge amounts of pressure on your media, on your businesses, on your political leaders, through all these different levers. And so one of the real efforts that we have in our project is to try and work not just with Americans, but also with foreign partners in Europe and Asia on these kinds of issues that are challenging democracies worldwide. So Laura, I'll hand it back to you for a couple of thoughts on what we should do about all of this.
Yeah, so we've spent a lot of time talking about the problem, the sort of negative aspects of this. So just to leave you with some points on sort of the hopeful front, because we do spend a lot of time thinking about what can we do about this. Both of us come out of the policymaking world, and we're always very focused on not just what is the problem, but what can we do about it. The first point that I would say is that we think about this as a whole of society problem. This is not something that government alone can or should address. And frankly, I would argue that in democracies, there's lots of things that when it comes to information and speech, and political speech in particular, governments absolutely shouldn't do. I think one of the things that we feel pretty strongly about is that in responding to some of these tactics, there's at least as many things we shouldn't do as we should do. And one of the things we definitely shouldn't do is actually suppress speech. Focusing on regulating content, trying to control what people say, that's actually very much in line with what Zach just described that Beijing and Moscow are trying to do. Control and manipulation of information is their MO. And so if our response becomes, well, we need to control this space more, we actually play right into their hands. So that's point one for me, is that there's a lot of things that we need to be very mindful of what we shouldn't do. And so there's things that government can definitely do. And I think when it comes to thinking about how social media platforms are regulated, the kinds of behavior that's allowed on those platforms, the way that, frankly, data is collected and managed, and what that means for how the algorithms target information, those, for me, I think are areas where government has probably been lagging behind. But, again, staying very much away from that content perspective. There's absolutely a role for the private sector here. I mean, the platforms that are shaping so much of our information space really have a very significant role here. And I think it's a big challenge, actually, for us in a much broader sense, given that a lot of these platforms have grown very large, very fast. They've taken on roles that are traditionally ones that we think of being government roles, and now we have very large platforms that are accountable to their shareholders, but not accountable to citizens that are making some of these decisions. And so thinking through how do we work with them. And then civil society and the business community and community leaders more broadly, I think has a huge role to play here, because resilience, awareness of the problem, media literacy, civic education, some of these really basic things, some of the stuff that you guys actually do right here through some of your programs, I think is really, really important, because a lot of these tactics really take advantage of some of the vulnerabilities within our own society. And there's a lot of ways in which our democratic institutions have atrophied, where we have not invested what we need to be doing at home. And some of that is building that resilience in ourselves. I would say on that point, not to sort of beat a dead horse right here, but back to the bipartisan piece too. I mean, this is something that Zach and I believe in really strongly. If this issue is approached as a partisan one from either side, we are playing right into the hands again of those who are trying to weaken us. Our democracy cannot and should not be a partisan issue. And again, we need to preserve space for the debate, and that means preserving the foundations for that debate. We also need to be engaging in actions that will sort of increase our deterrence, and we can maybe get into some of that in the Q&A, but imposing costs on the bad actors that are engaging in these behaviors, really demonstrating that we see this weaponization of information very much as we would the deployment of other kinds of weapons against our system, and responding in a way that really raises the cost for doing so, I think is really important. And then the last piece is we do need to think about how we better defend ourselves, and I think that means new mechanisms for public-private cooperation. There's all sorts of challenges packed within this issue set where, again, given the nature of this whole society problem, we have to find new ways for different parts of our society to cooperate together on problems where we may not have those mechanisms. And so I think that's a really important area to be investing in as well. So I think there's a lot more we can get into, and we really look forward to the conversation and questions.
Great, thank you. Should I use this one or this one? All right, we'll use the podium mic. Now's the time when we welcome your questions. There's note cards at your table. They look like this. And so just write your question on there, hold it up, and someone from our team will come around to make sure that the discussion is as relevant as possible. And I'll go ahead and start off with a question. I recently read about Apple in Russia. Was going into the Russian market, and the Russians said, hey, the Apple Maps needs to have a specific thing in there that's not everyone agrees with, which is they wanted to have Crimea as part of Russia, which it's not, according to the U.S. Government. And so Apple, from what I read, and I don't know if it's still the case, said, okay, we'll in Russia, you'll see Crimea as part of Russia. Everywhere else, it won't be. And so I'm curious to know your reflection on, you talked about the role that companies play, or at least you touched on it. What is the role of companies in upholding democratic values in that kind of way? And tell us more about that, what you think.
I'll just say a couple of things about this. I think the pressure on some private businesses is tremendous to deal with this issue, right? And of course, we know that's the case with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, which is owned by Google, right? Which all face incredible political pressures to consider what should be allowed to be posted on their sites. What are the terms of use for those sites? Those are very well known. But actually, I think a lot of the most coercive tools that we're seeing are ones used against businesses that you wouldn't think have that critical a role to play in the public square, right? So I mentioned earlier that there are a number of movie companies that have changed what they've done in terms of having Chinese actors and actresses. And I think representation is a great thing. There's nothing wrong with that. But one thing that they've also done is that they've put, in some cases, maps, just like Apple, that are inaccurate into the American vernacular. So, for example, China has claimed a very large portion of the South China Sea with something it calls the 9-dash line, which has no basis in international law. The United States does not recognize this claim, and yet there have been 2 American movies recently that have somehow shown this with maps of China with this claim, right? And so business after business are facing these decisions. Do they want market access in China? Do they want to be able to produce goods in China? And same thing in some cases with Russia. Or are they willing to sacrifice those profits so that they can speak out on these political issues? And I think what we've seen is that right now there's no mechanism for these businesses to stand together. And if they get targeted one at a time, it is really difficult for them to stand up and explain to their shareholders why they've had to lose all of their business in some large market in exchange for a rather small political issue that they might not usually raise at a board meeting, for example. And so I think one of the real challenges for all of us is to think through how to work through these private businesses and public-private partnerships to help companies have an option, which is not to give in to this kind of pressure. And right now, we're just not there yet.
Yeah, I think, I will add to Zach's example of the 2 movies, actually in the wake of the sort of NBA episode that he mentioned earlier. ESPN actually also ran a map that showed this same 9-dash line of claim in the South China Sea. So again, it's a more subtle form, I think, of shaping perception and shaping how we see information. In some ways, I think that's almost more worrying in the long term than some of what I think of as the blunt force, sort of Russian-style disinformation and manipulation. But I think the other point I would note here is, obviously businesses have a certain set of interests that are guiding, their practices, and market access can be extremely important. What I think is important to bear in mind here is, we are, I think, only just beginning to see the even more aggressive posture of the Chinese Communist Party engaging in these tactics. I mean, the reasons that we're talking about these things today is actually, in my view, in some instances, they've kind of overstepped and sort of forced a counter reaction. These things have been going on for years. I mean, U.S. airlines were forced a couple of years ago to change how they talked about Taiwan in their systems. Marriott Hotel actually fired an employee for liking a tweet about Tibet under pressure from the Chinese Communist Party. So this has been going on, I think, for years, but we're seeing even more assertiveness. And my own view is, looking at the trajectory that Beijing is on, that's going to become an even more common practice. Certainly places like Moscow are watching all of this, taking a page from that book. We can certainly see how other authoritarian-minded regimes will understand how they can use coercive tools to shape information and public perception and use businesses to that end. And so I think at some point there's a strategic question. I mean, there's the tactical level questions of what do we do in this particular instance where we're being pressured. But there's a strategic question, I think, that businesses are going to have to face who are trying to do business in China in the long term, which is that, is this an environment that is developing that is one that businesses rooted in the free market and who believe that, that those sorts of institutions that are necessary to preserving the free market, is that actually compatible with the long run sort of strategic business environment that's being cultivated by China and in China? And I think that that's going to be a question that will be upon us sooner than later, because I think the temptation can be in the near term to say we'll swallow this, kind of ugly thing that we don't like doing. But at the end of the day, there's been an assumption for a long time that market liberalization in China would lead to broader reforms. And it's become pretty clear, I think, in the last 5 years that that's really not the direction we're heading. So what does that actually mean from a strategic business perspective? And are there other kinds of decisions that, again, businesses that depend on our free market institutions, our rule of law, right, basically reach a point of saying that that's not compatible with doing business in China?
Thank you.
I see a lot of cards over here.
Trying to organize them. There's a lot about the bipartisan and some comments about appreciating just that you are a bipartisan approach. Let's go with this one. What are your thoughts about changing the bipartisan system and opening it up during presidential debates, thereby encouraging information and democracy?
So it's interesting. I mean, I'm going to offer sort of a more philosophical answer to this question. There's a couple of different, actually, perspectives in the literature about the role of parties in democracy. And of course, George Washington famously, in his farewell address, argued against the political parties because he thought it would be very deleterious for democracy. There was another book it was a book more recently called How Democracy Dies. And it was looking at different ways, examples over time of democracies actually moving backwards. And the two professors who wrote this book actually conjectured that in part the corrosion of the party system, and by that I don't mean I mean sort of the functions of the parties within themselves, and the argument in this book is in part about the role of money in that. But that actually having strong political parties can actually be a good for democracy, representative democracy in particular, which is of course what we have. And that in some ways it's the dysfunction of the parties themselves that are actually leading to or undergirding some of the problems that we're seeing in our democracy. Now, there's also other systems globally, right, about multi-party, democratic systems where you have more coalition governments, mostly in parliamentary systems. And there are some examples where those have proven to be positive for democracies, and there are some. I mean, I look to Israel right now, which is about to have its third election in a year because after the first two, nobody's been able to form a government, where you have a multi-party parliamentary system that's not working so well for their democracy either. So, the literature on this is interesting, and I'm sort of multiple minds on some of this personally. I mean, to me, my sort of general bias is that there are probably multiple ways of doing this in a democratic system, that the most important piece is the integrity of the institutions that are involved in that, right? So whether it's the checks and balances or whether it's transparency, I think that those are some of the most important pieces, but curious for Zach's view.
I'll just add one really quick thought on this, which is that there's a lot of research that shows that actually what's changed in the party system is not that the two parties have become more separated ideologically, is that the people within those parties have now sorted themselves into the two parties more than they used to. So it used to be that you had more conservative or more moderate Democrats, and it used to be that you had more liberal or more moderate Republicans. And in fact, many of those people have now sorted themselves. And so if you're liberal, you're more likely to be a Democrat now. And if you're conservative, you're more likely to be Republican. And it turns out if you go back 20, 30 years, that actually wasn't the case to the same degree. And so one of the things that we're seeing is not actually that as a whole, the views have become more liberal or more conservative, is that the parties are more sorted. And so the ends of the parties, right, the most liberal Democrats and the most conservative Republicans now have more power than they used to have. And I do think that's a real challenge. And I do think to the extent that those parties don't represent moderate views in the same way, that it's going to open up room for third parties, right? And I think we've clearly seen, when folks like Michael Bloomberg talk about getting into the Democratic race, they're doing that because they think there's room to run, right? I mean, he was a Republican just a few years ago, right? And now he's running as a moderate Democrat. I think both parties have a risk that if they run too much towards the edges, that there is some danger for them of third-party challengers. I think one of the answers to some of this is different forms of electoral processes. So California has a different process, right, where you don't have a Democratic and a Republican candidate and challenging every seat. Sometimes you actually have two Democrats, and you could have two Republicans. It's just the largest two vote getters. It actually has more of an incentive for those people to run towards the middle, which is, I think, where we are going to want to see more people. So there are some small changes to the way that our democracy works that could get at some of these issues.
Great, thank you. Is the U.S. employing similar tactics in other countries?
Great question.
So my view is no. Which is not to say that the United States hasn't interfered in foreign countries in the past, right? But, and Laura's going to say more about this in a second, because this is an issue we frequently debate. But I think there is a there's a fundamental difference between an authoritarian state meddling in a democracy and a democracy trying to promote civil society abroad, right? And what Laura will probably say in a second is it's the difference between trying to tear down a society and trying to build up civil society. And what the United States does through some really fantastic institutions, which are both Republican and Democratic aligned and nonpartisan, are trying to build up civil societies, build up democracies, right? Make it easier for people to ensure that their views are represented by their political leaders. That is not what we're seeing by the Russians. It's the opposite. The Russians want to make it harder for people to have their views represented by political leaders. They want to foster disagreement and violence within societies. So I don't think it's the same, which is not to say that the United States has always, in every situation, been a perfect force for good, but it's to say that I do think there's a fundamental different quality between what we typically have done and what we're seeing from some authoritarian governments today.
My propaganda has clearly worked on Zach because he adopted some of my talking points, so I'm just kidding. But no, I mean, I think he laid this out very well. I'll say a couple of other points. One is that, yes, I mean, there are examples, certainly from the Cold War era, where the U.S. did engage in certain kinds of more direct interference in other countries' societies, and of course the Soviet Union was very much doing the same thing. End of the Cold War, we said, okay, like we're not going to do that anymore. Soviet Union's gone. They're not doing it. We're not doing it. So we stopped. Russia didn't, and we've seen that sort of in spades now. So the kinds of things we're talking about, the manipulation of information, the injection of false narratives, the creation of false personas, all of that, the sort of censorship of content, that is really not something that the U.S. engages in any way, shape, or form at this point in time. And I mean, both for the reasons I said earlier about our sort of values and why I don't think that that's a thing that the U.S. should be doing. I also would say that we're really bad at it. And if you look back historically, we were bad at it. But part of the reason is, I mentioned earlier, the sort of asymmetry of this particular set of tactics. And the reality is that authoritarian regimes for whom controlling and manipulating information is just the way they do business, they're always going to be willing to go further than we are in democracies, and they're always going to be better at trying to hide it. This is one of the good things about our openness and our transparency and our values, is that these kinds of things are not behaviors or tactics that we actually are good at, and I think that's a good thing. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't be investing more in some of the stuff that we've done in the past about really promoting truthful information and ensuring that there's not sort of vacuums in part of the world where other governments can come in and try and fill that space with narratives that are less truthful and that frankly are against the interests of the United States? I absolutely think that when it comes to promoting truthful information, we should be engaging in that. Now, again, I would say messenger matters here, and sort of there are some people who want to stand up, sort of rebuild institutions, government sort of led institutions that we had during the Cold War that were, Edward R. Murrow kind of promoting information models. And the thing that's changed is, messenger matters as much as message in a lot of these areas. And the US government's just not a credible messenger in a lot of spaces, both domestically and internationally. So that means empowering civil society again. To really be out there and reporting on truth, providing people with resources, and that also means even in our own country, I would say, state and local, independent media and sort of local media has really taken a hit in the past, really 10 years in particular, and social media has played a role in this, the changing media landscape broadly, but when you look at surveys of Americans, local media is still actually one of the most trusted sources of information. And that really, and this is true globally, by the way, we need to be reinvesting in independent media. We need to be reinvesting in local media. These are assets that we have, and I think that's really, really important. But all that to say, the U.S. really doesn't engage in these kinds of things, and nor do I think that we should. I think we need to focus on what are our own strengths and where do our values align with promoting a sort of information space that we want.
Just one very quick last point on this. I think both of us can tell you, having been in government, that if the U.S. was doing this at a large scale, it would take about 10 days to leak.
Yeah.
There is nothing in Washington that stays secret for long. And so if the United States was engaging in this type of behavior, you would know about it. And it wouldn't be through rumors. You would have hard evidence. There would be major exposés in major media that would be talking about this in great detail. So I just don't think it happens, and certainly not in the same kind of way that authoritarian governments are pursuing information manipulation.
Great, thank you. Is the disinformation effort targeting children at all, shaping Gen Z's point of view on democracy?
I mean, one area where we've seen that is TikTok. TikTok is used mostly by young people, a lot by teens, and I think absolutely we've seen efforts to shift how teens think about human rights issues, especially in China. And there's no question that it's easier to influence people when they're younger, before their minds are made up about these issues. And so I don't know that we have a lot of evidence of that kind of targeting, but I think it would absolutely make sense, and that the kinds of authoritarian actors we're seeing are smart. They know they're in this for the long term, and of course they're going to target people when they're younger, when they have more influence over the views that those people are going to hold when they're of voting age.
And I would just quickly note, too, that while our focus is on the sort of foreign actors that are engaging in these kinds of activities targeting our democracy, there's a pretty robust domestic disinformation environment that's quite active in the U.S. and in many other countries around the world. And while that's not really the focus of the work that we do, what we know is that really brittle information environment that's being promoted at home makes a more ripe target surface, if you will, right? So it makes us more vulnerable then to the authoritarian actors or the foreign actors who want to come in over the top and sort of nudge things in the direction that they want to go. So the more polluted our information environment is already, the more that it's easier for others to engage in more targeted kinds of manipulation. And there's definitely evidence that some of that more domestically focused disinformation is targeting youth in different ways. But what I would say on top of that, though, is that interestingly, some of the studies that have looked at sort of generationally where are the biggest vulnerabilities to disinformation, and it's actually in 65 and older. And some of that, I think, has to do with just the transformation of the information space. And in some ways, while our youth are far more exposed to all this technology, they also are far more exposed to all this technology. And so they've grown up in an environment where they have a little bit of a better understanding of how to navigate some of this. And, whereas, even me, TikTok is not, I've spent a lot of time studying TikTok, but it's not a platform I would even know how to navigate whatsoever, right? And there's plenty of these platforms that are not sort of comfortable for me to interact with. Because I didn't grow up with them. And when you grow up in this environment, I do think it's different. So there's actually some very interesting data that I think it's very easy, especially when we think about things like media literacy, to think just about our youth. And I would say that that's important, and that's not to be neglected, but that we also need to think about sort of other parts of the population. The one other point I would make just on the topic of youth is that one thing that is worrying to me here is that there have been numerous studies that have looked at attitudes toward democracy, generationally in the US and in Europe. And one of the things that these studies have found, it was pretty controversial at first and it's now been seen over multiple studies, is that there is an eroding importance that younger generations attach to democracy as a system of government. And it's small numbers. It's not like, you know, the floor has cratered from underneath us. But when we have people who are coming to voting age who don't necessarily think that democracy itself is a system worth preserving, that's a really big challenge for us. And so for me, that speaks to the importance of civic education and reinvesting in, you know, reminding our youth and ourselves why democracy actually matters in our lives.
Thank you. Have there been any legislative proposals in Congress to incentivize private companies to act autonomously from foreign influences like China, Russia, et cetera?
So there have been a lot of proposals in Congress. There have been a lot of bipartisan proposals in Congress. There has not been a lot of action by Congress to do anything about all of those proposals, which is a sort of broader point on where democracy is and is not functioning and where our institutions are or are not working. You know, some of the proposals involve very basic things, like the fact that political advertising, if you are a campaign or a candidate or working on a particular, you know, legislative issue, and you purchase an ad on television, on the radio, in a newspaper, there are certain requirements both on the person or the entity purchasing that ad about disclosure and transparency, and then there are certain requirements on the platforms that are carrying that around disclosure and vetting and transparency and all this kind of stuff. Those standards don't apply in the digital space. There's a long history as to why, but mostly it's just an area where our law has not caught up with the times. And there's a huge amount of spending on political advertising that is happening on social media, and we have absolutely no law that governs it. Like, let me say that again. We have absolutely no law that governs hundreds of millions of dollars of spending on political advertising that is being, by the way, targeted in very, very methodical, specific ways to each and every person in this room. And that's only one piece of the problem. Like, even if we were to impose some regulation around political advertising online, we're only getting at a slice of this. But the reality is, you know, we've got to start somewhere. And so that's one piece. There's been bipartisan legislation that has been sitting in both actually the House has passed this now. There's been bipartisan legislation originally championed by Senator McCain on the Republican side and Amy Klobuchar on the Democratic side, and now Lindsey Graham has stepped in now that Senator McCain has passed. But even that legislation, that basic piece, has not been able to pass. There's broader pieces. I mean, I mentioned earlier, it sounds a little bit, I think, disconnected from some of this, but in fact, you know, the U.S. doesn't have any real legislation around data privacy and data protection. Europe is far ahead of the United States on this. They passed a law, the General Data Protection Regulation, that went into effect last year, that puts in place some requirements for platforms that are collecting data. And the reason that matters is it's the data that powers the algorithms that enable the manipulation and then that enable the targeting. And it's all one big sort of digital ecosystem there. And right now, California has a law that they've passed that goes into effect, I think in 2 years, that will sort of take on board some of the ideas from Europe. But we don't have that at a national level in the US. There's other states who are starting to think about following the California model and actually passing some legislation at the state level, and I think that that's probably a good idea. But there's a number of other areas like that where there could be some legislation passed and where there's good ideas on the table, where we've just not been able to move these things, in part because, frankly, these issues have been really caught up in the partisan politics in Washington, which I think is really to our detriment for all the reasons we've talked about today.
Great. And last question, although we have many more, and our speakers are gracious enough to stay a little bit later if you want to ask your question directly. how effectively can disinformation be measured, and are sufficient resources allocated? I hear a sigh. I hear like this question must come frequently.
So the sigh is in part because it comes up a lot, and obviously trying to understand the impact is really important in terms when we're talking about both passing legislation and putting resources toward a problem. We want to know really, how much does this matter? It is. To the first part of the question, how effectively can it be measured? The reality is it's extraordinarily hard to actually measure it. If you think about the number of pieces of information that you encounter every single day through whether it's your newspaper, your local news channel, your national news, your Facebook feed, your Twitter feed, all the different ways that you're encountering information, trying to understand how any one piece of that is affecting your views or changing your views is extraordinarily hard. And so, trying to understand both where is all the disinformation coming from in the first place, who all is it targeting, and for a variety of reasons, actually some of them it goes back to the question of the companies. A lot of the companies actually don't even provide researchers with the kind of information they would need to be able to study this in the first place. And so it's very hard to be able to see where the disinformation is sort of reaching people, and then doing a sort of before-after of what impact did that have. So the reality is, at the moment, there aren't really effective ways to measure this. I mean, there have been some attempts, but I'm personally not persuaded that anybody has quite figured out exactly to do that. And on the resource allocation point, I would say that for me, I really will go back to this data access question. It sounds like maybe a sort of technical and sort of research wonky thing, but actually, there is a huge imperative for these platforms that, again, are, you think about Facebook, 2 billion people are on Facebook. I mean, it is really, that is larger than any single government in the world, right? In terms of the number of people that they are sort of having every day or on a regular basis on their platform. And it is impossible, it is really impossible to get data that gives any sort of representative view on what's happening on the platform from Facebook. And so, there's been pressure put on them from donors. For anybody who's interested in this particular question, I can go down a long rabbit hole, but actually a bunch of really great donors stepped up a couple of years ago and put forward a bunch of money to create an actual very specific effort to research and try to measure this very particular question. And at this point, the donors have all pulled out, and most of the researchers have pulled out, because a year and a half later, none of the data that was promised by Facebook has actually materialized. And so I think it's not even just a question of sort of resources in a financial sense. We really need to find ways to, at this point, I would say, compel the platforms to provide this data to researchers. Now, it has to be done in a way that protects people's privacy, of course, right? And that enables, that ensures that there are protections against the kind of abuses, frankly, that we saw in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But there are ways to do that, and we just have not gotten there yet.
And just one last point to make on this, which is that regardless of whether we know exactly the magnitude of the effect of this disinformation, we know it's having an effect, right? And we know that we want our democracy and our institutions and our processes to be determined by Americans, not by people living halfway across the world, right? So I think regardless of the exact magnitude, we know that we need to take action on this issue. And I've been heartened whenever we get out of Washington and actually talk to folks about this issue. People care about it, and people are paying attention. And I think part of what was a challenge 3 years ago is a lot of us just didn't know anything about any of this activity that was occurring. And so step one is understanding that there is malign influence that's occurring, and we're not where we need to be, I think, in having bipartisan answers. But I do think there's a little bit of movement in this regard. So the House and Senate just passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and there is actually some legislation in there, both to study what Russia, China, Iran, and others are doing, and to start coming up with some organizational fixes. So are we where we need to be? Absolutely not. But I think we're slowly waking up to this challenge, and I do think on a bipartisan basis, we can start to address it. But again, there's a huge amount of work to be done.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Zach and Laura. And thank you each for being here today. Enjoy the rest of your day today, your week, and the rest of the year. Thank you. We are adjourned.